Tonight, the Middle East is moving faster than most governments can brief and faster than most headlines can explain. In the last 4 days, 3 separate lines of escalation have converged into one crisis. Direct strikes on Iran's nuclear infrastructure, a widening regional front that now includes Lebanon again, and a leadership shock inside Iran that raises one question above all others: who is actually in charge and what happens next? And then came the sentence that turned a military campaign into a political earthquake. In an interview with ABC News, President Donald Trump was asked who would lead Iran now that Ayatollah Ali Khamenei is dead. Trump's answer was blunt. The strike was so successful, he said, it knocked out most of the candidates. In his words, the people the United States had in mind are all dead, and even the second or third choices are dead as well. Before we go any further, one important clarification. Trump's statement is a claim about targeting and results. In war, claims are also weapons. Governments exaggerate, minimize, and shape perception to influence the next move. So the responsible approach is this. Treat Trump's line as politically significant because it signals intent and confidence while remembering that independent verification of who exactly is alive, dead, or incapacitated may lag behind the rhetoric. Whether you support this operation or oppose it, you should understand what the claim implies. A strike that removes a head of state is one level of escalation. A strike that also removes the people positioned to replace him is something else entirely. It means uncertainty is not a side effect. It becomes the battlefield. So let's break down what is confirmed, what is claimed, and what the most realistic next steps look like based on reporting from major outlets and statements from official bodies. I'm going to keep this grounded, because in a moment like this, rumor spreads faster than missiles. First, Natanz. Natanz is not a random target. It is Iran's best-known uranium enrichment complex, built with underground protection specifically to survive attacks. This week, the International Atomic Energy Agency confirmed that recent U.S.-Israeli strikes damaged entrance buildings to Iran's underground Natanz fuel enrichment plant. The watchdog also said there were no radiological consequences detected, and that the main underground facility did not appear to have suffered additional major damage beyond what had already happened in earlier attacks. That last point matters. No radiological consequences does not mean no damage. It means there was no nuclear incident, no release measured, no public warning triggered. But the absence of a radiation event tells you very little about whether centrifuges were disabled, whether electrical systems were wrecked, or whether the site can function as an industrial complex. Also, entrances are not cosmetic. An underground enrichment plant depends on access routes for people, replacement parts, feedstock, and maintenance. If you damage the vehicle entrances, the personnel entrances, the lift systems, or the tunnel network, you can turn a working facility into a sealed box. A sealed box is safer in one sense, but it can be useless operationally. Think of it like this. You can own the most expensive server room on Earth. If the power is cut, the cooling is compromised, and nobody can physically get to the racks, that server room might as well be a museum. Now, zoom out. The Natanz strike is not just about centrifuges. It is about leverage. For Washington and Jerusalem, hitting nuclear infrastructure is a way to reduce Iran's options and reshape the negotiation table. For Tehran, surviving those strikes and continuing to function is a way to prove that pressure does not work, that endurance is victory, and that deterrence still exists. Which brings us to the second front, Lebanon. On March 1, Hezbollah fired rockets toward northern Israel for the first time since the November 2024 ceasefire. Israel responded with strikes in Lebanon, and the risk everyone feared is back on the table. A second active front at the same moment the Iran campaign is intensifying. But here is the truly unusual development. Lebanon's own government moved to ban Hezbollah's military activities, declaring that decisions of war and peace belong to the Lebanese state and calling for Hezbollah to hand over its weapons. If you've followed Lebanon for any length of time, you know how explosive that is. Hezbollah is not just another party. It is the most heavily armed non-state actor in the country, backed for decades by Iran, and deeply embedded in Lebanon's political and security reality. So what does a ban mean in practice? It means Beirut is trying to stop a war it did not choose, in the middle of a war it cannot control. It also means Hezbollah now faces pressure from 2 directions at once: Israeli fire from the south and political pressure from the Lebanese cabinet at home. The problem is that a cabinet decision does not disarm rockets in real time. Enforcement is the hard part, and enforcement in Lebanon is never simple. A ban can also be read as a signal to the world. Lebanon is saying, do not treat our entire state as the enemy. It is an attempt to separate the Lebanese government from Hezbollah's military decisions before Israel's retaliation makes that distinction impossible. Third, American casualties. U.S. Central Command has confirmed that 6 American service members have been killed in the operation so far. That number may rise, and every additional casualty changes the political mathematics in Washington. This is where campaigns collide with constitutions. You can already see pressure building through the war powers debate and the questions about authorization, strategy, and the end state. The hardest question is not, can the United States hit targets? It is, what comes after the targets are hit? Because once you strike this deep and this openly, you own the consequences whether you want to or not. Coalitions matter here too. Even when allies agree on Iran as a threat, they do not always agree on the method, the timing, or the legal framing. Spain, for example, has publicly said the United States is not using and will not be using joint bases on Spanish territory for operations against Iran. In a sustained air campaign, base access is not a detail, it is a lifeline. Now back to the leadership problem inside Iran, because leadership determines whether there is a channel for negotiation, a path to de-escalation, or a new cycle of retaliation. So who is running Iran right now? Reports describe an interim arrangement, a temporary 3-person council that includes the president, the head of the judiciary, and a senior cleric linked to the Guardian Council. Their job is not to redesign the state. Their job is to keep the state running long enough for the Assembly of Experts, an 8-member clerical body, to choose a new supreme leader. But choosing a supreme leader is not like choosing a prime minister. It is not an ordinary transfer of power. It is a theological, institutional, and security decision all at once. The supreme leader is the apex of the system, and the Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, is the most powerful armed institution inside that system. Here is the dilemma. The Assembly of Experts is supposed to meet and decide, but the country is under bombardment. Reuters has reported that Iranian officials fear a successor could be targeted as soon as he emerges, which could push the selection process into delays, secrecy, or rapid compromise. So the system faces 2 bad options. Option 1, pick quickly to project stability and deter internal fracture. Option 2, delay to protect the candidate, keep options open, and avoid painting a target on the next leader's back. Either way, the IRGC's role becomes heavier. When civilian institutions are shaken, armed institutions fill the vacuum. That does not automatically mean a coup. It means influence. It means veto power. It means the ability to decide what national security requires and what the acceptable costs are. Third, American casualties. U.S. Central Command has confirmed that 6 American service members have been killed in the operation so far. That number may rise, and every additional casualty changes the political mathematics in Washington. This is where campaigns collide with constitutions. You can already see pressure building through the war powers debate and the questions about authorization, strategy, and the end state. The hardest question is not, can the United States hit targets? It is, what comes after the targets are hit? Because once you strike this deep and this openly, you own the consequences whether you want to or not. Coalitions matter here too. Even when allies agree on Iran as a threat, they do not always agree on the method, the timing, or the legal framing. Spain, for example, has publicly said the United States is not using and will not be using joint bases on Spanish territory for operations against Iran. In a sustained air campaign, base access is not a detail. It is a lifeline. Now, back to the leadership problem inside Iran, because leadership determines whether there is a channel for negotiation, a path to de-escalation, or a new cycle of retaliation. So who is running Iran right now? Reports describe an interim arrangement, a temporary 3-person council that includes the president, the head of the judiciary, and a senior cleric linked to the Guardian Council. Their job is not to redesign the state. Their job is to keep the state running long enough for the Assembly of Experts, an 8-member clerical body, to choose a new supreme leader. But choosing a supreme leader is not like choosing a prime minister. It is not an ordinary transfer of power. It is a theological, institutional, and security decision all at once. The supreme leader is the apex of the system, and the Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, is the most powerful armed institution inside that system. Here is the dilemma. The Assembly of Experts is supposed to meet and decide, but the country is under bombardment. Reuters has reported that Iranian officials fear a successor could be targeted as soon as he emerges, which could push the selection process into delays, secrecy, or rapid compromise. So the system faces two bad options. Option 1, pick quickly to project stability and deter internal fracture. Option 2, delay to protect the candidate, keep options open, and avoid painting a target on the next leader's back. Either way, the IRGC's role becomes heavier. When civilian institutions are shaken, armed institutions fill the vacuum. That does not automatically mean a coup. It means influence. It means veto power. It means the ability to decide what national security requires and what the acceptable costs are. Now, layer Trump's ABC comment on top of that. If Trump is right that multiple succession candidates were killed, the leadership pipeline is not just disrupted, it is redesigned under fire. That creates incentives for hardliners to double down and prove they cannot be intimidated. It also creates incentives for pragmatic factions to search for an off-ramp before the next strike hits the next meeting. And you can already see contradictory signals in public. Some Iranian figures are publicly rejecting negotiations outright. At the same time, U.S. officials and Trump himself have suggested Iran's new leadership, whoever it is, wants to talk. Those are not mutually exclusive messages in a crisis. In many wars, both are true at the same time. Leaders posture publicly to avoid looking weak, while sending feelers privately to avoid catastrophe. But here is the key. Until Iran has a confirmed supreme leader, any diplomatic signal can be tactical, temporary, and reversible. That makes it hard for the United States to trust it, and hard for Iran to enforce it. Now, let's talk about the energy shock, because it is the part of the story that hits everyone's wallet. Reuters has reported that the conflict is disrupting shipping and energy supply, and that Iran has declared the Strait of Hormuz closed to foreign vessels. Whether the closure is total or partial, even the threat of disruption injects a war premium into every barrel. About 1/5 of global oil and LNG shipments normally transit Hormuz. When that choke point is threatened, shipping insurers pull back, rerouting begins, rates jump, and tankers start waiting offshore rather than gambling on a run through the strait. And that is not theoretical. Shipping data cited in reporting shows at least 150 oil and LNG vessels have dropped anchor in and around Hormuz and nearby waters during the disruption. When ships stop, supply chains do not pause politely, they buckle. Cargo piles up. Refineries wait. Power utilities scramble. And every day of delay tightens the market further. We have already seen the impact in prices. Reuters reports Brent crude rose roughly 7% in one session to the low $80 range per barrel after briefly touching higher levels, while U.S. crude climbed into the mid to high 70s. And analysts are openly warning that if disruption becomes sustained, prices could move dramatically higher. And it's not only oil. LNG is the quiet pressure point. When LNG deliveries slip, power grids feel it, industry feels it, households feel it. Countries far from the Middle East feel it because energy is the bloodstream of the global economy. So even if you live nowhere near Tehran, Beirut, or Jerusalem, you can still end up paying for this conflict at the pump, in your heating bill, and in the price of groceries. Markets are reacting like markets always do in a crisis. They sell what feels risky and buy what feels safe. In the first wave, you see oil up, gas up, and volatility everywhere. But markets can also misread war. They can assume disruption is temporary right up until it isn't. And by the time the not temporary reality is priced in, the damage is already done. Next, the international response. At the United Nations, the optics have become surreal. On March 2, First Lady Melania Trump chaired a UN Security Council meeting focused on children, technology, and education in conflict zones, an unprecedented role for the spouse of a sitting leader. The meeting was planned before the latest escalation, but it happened under the shadow of it, and it drew sharp criticism from Iran. This is what crisis diplomacy looks like in real time. Competing narratives fighting for legitimacy on the same stage where legitimacy is supposed to be negotiated. Meanwhile, major powers are positioning themselves for the outcome. Russia and China are condemning the strikes and calling for an immediate return to diplomacy. European states are split between concern about Iran's nuclear ambitions and alarm about escalation, legality, and refugee spillover. Gulf states are watching their infrastructure and shipping lanes become potential targets, even as they depend on U.S. security guarantees. So where do we go from here? If you strip away the drama, the next phase is likely to revolve around 5 questions. Question 1. How damaged is Natanz in operational terms? The IAEA has confirmed entrance damage and no radiological incident, but the operational picture depends on whether Iran can move people, materials, and equipment safely, whether power and ventilation are intact, and whether repair crews can even reach the site. A facility can be not destroyed and still be not usable. Question 2. Can the assembly of experts actually meet and choose a leader under airstrikes? If the body convenes openly, it may become a target. If it meets secretly, legitimacy becomes harder to demonstrate. If it delays, the Interim Leadership Council holds the wheel longer, and the IRGC's leverage expands. Question 3. Does Hezbollah stay in, or does Lebanon manage to pull it back? The Lebanese cabinet's ban is bold, but implementation will collide with reality. If Hezbollah continues launching, Israel will continue striking, and Lebanon may slide into a broader war it cannot afford. Question 4. What happens to U.S. domestic support as casualties rise? 6 deaths already shift the tone. More deaths change the debate. Even a president with political momentum has to manage public opinion, congressional pressure, and allied cooperation all at once. And question 5, will Hormuz remain disrupted? If shipping remains constrained for weeks, this becomes more than a war story. It becomes an energy crisis story. The longer the disruption lasts, the more inflation risk spreads globally, and the higher the political costs climb for every government involved. Now, here is the part most commentators avoid saying out loud. Regime change is not a policy. It is a sequence of decisions that demands an answer to the question, what replaces the regime, and who guarantees the replacement? If the goal is simply to weaken Iran's nuclear program, then the measure of success is technical and time-bound. If the goal is to change the regime, the measure of success is political, messy, and open-ended. History shows that removing the top does not automatically create stability. Sometimes it creates a vacuum that extremist factions fill. Sometimes it creates fragmentation. Sometimes it creates a long insurgency. And sometimes it produces a negotiated transition, but only if internal and external actors converge on a viable alternative. So what happens now is not one event, it is a race. A race between escalation and negotiation. A race between institutional continuity and leadership collapse. A race between a controlled end state and a regional spillover that pulls in more actors than anyone planned. There are 4 broad pathways from here. Pathway 1 is a fast, negotiated pause. That usually starts with quiet back channels, a limited ceasefire window, and a face-saving formula that lets both sides claim victory. You would see it first in messaging. Fewer absolute statements, more talk about protecting civilians, and more emphasis on conditions rather than surrender. Pathway 2 is the long campaign Trump has described: weeks of strikes designed to grind down capabilities, pressure the IRGC, and force Iran's elite to choose between escalation and survival. In this pathway, the main risk is miscalculation. One strike hits the wrong site, one missile hits the wrong base, and the war expands by accident. Pathway 3 is regional spillover. Hezbollah stays active, Israel hits harder, Iran's proxies move, and Gulf energy infrastructure becomes a battlefield. This is the pathway where markets stop treating the shock as temporary and start treating it as a structural crisis. Pathway 4 is internal fracture inside Iran. A contested succession, competing power centers, and a security state under stress can create unpredictable outcomes, anything from a tightened crackdown to a sudden chaotic bargaining process. This is the pathway that outside powers often claim to want and then discover they cannot control. Which pathway we are on will be signaled by a few concrete things: whether Hormuz traffic normalizes or stays frozen, whether Iran's succession process produces a single name or a fog of secrecy, and whether the next 24 hours bring new fronts or fewer rockets. And remember, most wars do not end when one side runs out of weapons. They end when leaders decide the price of continuing is higher than the price of stopping. In the next 48 to 72 hours, watch for 3 signals. 1. A credible announcement from Iran about the succession process, whether the Assembly of Experts has met, whether the Interim Council remains in place, and whether the IRGC's posture shifts from defense to dominance. 2. evidence of sustained Hezbollah operations, and whether the Lebanese state takes practical steps to enforce its ban, or whether the announcement remains symbolic. 3. Shipping and energy data. Are tankers still waiting? Are insurers still canceling coverage? Are prices still climbing? Those numbers will tell you how much of this war is staying in the region and how much is leaking into the world economy. We are going to keep tracking this story as it moves, because it is changing by the hour. If you want clear updates without the noise, subscribe and turn on notifications. And in the comments, tell me what you think is the real hinge point here: the leadership vacuum in Tehran, the widening front in Lebanon, or the energy choke point at Hormuz. Because whichever one breaks first may decide how this ends.